In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to use MoGraph shaders to influence the color of our clones. Okay, so we can see in this scene that I have several different objects that are just being cloned out using a cloner object. Now, what I'd like to do is take a look at some features that we have for actually shading and coloring these different clones. So the first thing we need to do is actually create ourselves a new material. So let's just double click down here in the Material Manager. Okay, here's our new material. Let's go down into the color. Now for our texture, if we open this up, we actually have the option to actually create a few different MoGraph textures and shaders that we can use. So for this course, we're going to look at the multi-shader. This is probably the most commonly used shader that you're going to be using. So we'll drop in this multi-shader. Let's go ahead and click on that. And now we actually have the ability to create some different shaders that can be blended on these different clones. So in my case, I'll go ahead and add, let's say maybe a total of 5 different shaders. So now on shader 1, I'll go ahead and add something like a color. All right, and we'll give this maybe a green color or whatever we choose. We'll go back up, go to color 2, or rather shader 2, add another color. And again, we'll just come in here and continue to choose a few random colors in here. Okay, so I've just paused this for a second while I went ahead and created the rest of these different colors in here. So I should now have a total of 5 different colors in here. So this should work well for my particular sake. Now, within this mode, at the very top of our multi-shader, we do have a few options to choose from. We have index ratio, color brightness, red, green, and blue. So let's start with the index ratio. This will probably be the easiest one to see. So I can take my index ratio with that set, now take my material, click, and I'll apply this to the actual cloner itself. All right, and now you can see with this applied that we start to get all these different colors that we've set up within our multi-shader applied to our clones. So you can see that there's actually a very distinct relationship between these actual clones and the actual colors themselves. So you can see whereas in this first area we start with green, then we proceed on to yellow, then to white, blue, and then to orange. And these are the exact colors that I have set up in my multi-shader. So this is the effect that we'll get with the mode set to index ratio. So with the index ratio, what it essentially will do is look at the ordering of these clones that they're created. So it will take the first set of clones, give them the color of our first shader, take the second set of clones, and so on and so forth. So like I said, this index ratio method is good if we want to actually create a distinct sequence of colors across our clones. Now, what if we actually wanted to have each one of these clones maybe randomly choose one of these different colors? That's probably a little bit more likely scenario that we're going to face. Well, we can actually do this with one of our effectors. So if we go up to MoGraph, Effector, we can actually use something like the random effector. So let's again go into our clone, into the effector, make sure that our random effector is in here. Now you can see once I connect this in that we start to get some random movement within our clones. So let's go into our random effector, and within the parameter, let's go ahead and set the position checkbox off. So now at this point you can see there is no randomization in our movement whatsoever. Now in one of our earlier lessons I had mentioned that we were going to come in and talk about this color mode. So this is where this actually comes in when we actually want to randomize colors chosen within this multi-shader. So in the color mode, let's go ahead and set that to on. And you'll notice really nothing happens. Well, that's because right now this multi-shader that we've set up is still set to index ratio, which means it still explicitly looks at the age of our clones and uses that to shade across. Now what we could do instead is set this mode to something like color brightness. Now with this set to color brightness, we can actually utilize this random effector. So at first, looking at this, you might not quite understand what's going on, because we do have options for different blending modes, and at first it really just kind of looks like it's randomly choosing colors. Now, we can actually see this with a little bit more clarity if I were to set my color mode to user-defined. And again, if you recall this multi-shader, we had actually set this to a mode called color brightness. So it's essentially now looking at brightness values to choose my color. Now what that means is that if I were to set this to something like an HSV within the actual random parameter in the color mode, if I set this to a HSV, we actually have this little slider here. Now, as I start to move this value back and forth, you can see that with a value of 0, we get essentially the first color of our multi-shader. As I start to increase this, we can now see we switch to our second color, our third color, fourth color, and finally our fifth color. So essentially what we're doing is randomizing this color brightness across each one of our different clones, which gives us a slightly different color at the end. Okay, so just set this back to on, and there we are. And now we have these individual clones that are each choosing just sort of a random color from our multi-shader. But again, very, very important that you have this set to color brightness or color RG or B. If you set it back to index ratio, you can see it completely overrides our random effect and instead goes back to what we had before. Now, when it comes to actually shading these different clones, if we go back to our random effector here, go back to the actual effector tab, you can see that we do still have control over the different random settings. We can come in here and start to adjust the random seed if we want to maybe shift some of those colors around or until we find something that we like. We can also still have full control over these different options, so setting this to a Gaussian mode, to noise, turbulence, and so on and so forth. Now, we also have this sorted mode, and I had mentioned again in one of our earlier lessons that we were actually going to talk about this with a little bit more detail. The sorted mode actually becomes a little bit easier to see if we were to maybe dial down the number of clones. Let's maybe set it to a total of 5 clones. There we are, so that way we have essentially the same number of clones as we do the number of shaders in our multi-shader. Okay, so again, 5 different shaders here and 5 different clones. But you notice with my random effect that it's completely random, and it's so random in fact that it actually is not choosing certain colors. So you notice that something like white is completely missing. So if I go back to my random effector, the sorted mode is still sort of random, but it's random in the fact that it will still try to use all of the colors that we've chosen in our multi-shader. So you can see it will still come in and make sure that all of those get used. But it is still somewhat random as far as the actual order that it will try to pick those in. Now, here's something that is going to be really, really important to keep in mind whenever working with something like this multi-shader that we have connected. Once this is connected to our cloner, this multi-shader will only affect any objects that don't already have some kind of a texture tag applied. So for example, if I were to go back to my cloner, and let's say I dial my count back up to, let's say maybe 20, just for the sake of demonstration. If I were to, let's say, make a new material, and I'll just shade this black just for demonstration, and if I took this black material and put this onto my torus, you'll notice that once this cloner is applied, that all of my different torus objects are completely black. So if these objects do already have some kind of an existing texture tag, this multi-material or this multi-shader will have no effect on those particular objects. Now, this is actually something that could be really, really useful. So, for example, I have, just for very simple demonstration, a single sphere and a couple of different toruses. These have just been parented underneath a null and then cloned. Now, what if I actually wanted the sphere to actually be different colors between all of these different clones, but everything else I want it to be the same color? So these two different toruses, I have a white one and sort of a dark gray one. Both these toruses already have their own material that's been applied to them, but this sphere, you can see, does not have any kind of a texture tag. So, if I made myself a new multi-shader, and let's say I have 3 different textures applied here, I can take that multi-shader, drop that onto my cloner. There we are. And what we should see is once we actually get back to this shader here, let's go ahead and again make sure that this is set to index ratio, so in my case, it actually will shade these properly. You can see, again, some really, really useful features that we can start to see here. So each one of these spheres is a little bit different color because, again, we have that material that's been applied, but because each one of these toruses already have a texture tag applied to them, these no longer receive any influence from the multi-shader. So that's a look at some options that we have for actually shading our various MoGraph clones.